In this lecture, I want to talk about a word, a concept that is absolutely central to the contemporary English language, which you all know, the word mind. And very interestingly, and this must raise very large questions, it appears to me that this word is not translatable into Russian. That is an absolutely central concept in contemporary English language philosophy, does not have a corresponding word in Russian. Now that must in itself raise a philosophical question about the status of this concept. Now let me start by just I get hot when I talk. It's a sign of nervous energy. There is a sheet that you should all have a copy of, this sheet with notes about this lecture. Everybody has a copy of the sheet. Yes, good. I want to start with two quotations from a book which is called A Companion to the Philosophy of Mind. It's a typical contemporary English language reference book. A Companion to the Philosophy of Mind. Edited by a London philosopher, Samuel Guttenblatt. And he writes two things which I think are very interesting right at the beginning of the book. He says, firstly, that the philosophy of mind is easily the most active sub-discipline of philosophy. That is, philosophy of mind is the biggest, most active area of contemporary philosophy. If this is true in the English-speaking world, what are we to say about the Russian-speaking world, where there is no mind? The second quotation is, he takes it for granted, he just states it without any question. Human beings definitely have minds. Again, I want to ask, well, if your language does not have a word for mind, what is it that you have if you're a human being? And the whole difficulty of this statement, human beings definitely have minds, is this very simple question, but do animals have minds? That is mind supposed to be something that is unique to human beings? Or is it something that is distributed across the biological kingdom, as one would presuppose if one takes evolution seriously? And in fact, the controversy and difficulty people have in talking about animal minds raises many of the central questions of the philosophy of mind. Now, mind is clearly a collective word for mental or psychic being. But there are fundamental disagreements about what that is. What is mental or psychic being? And those questions are simply disguised, kept to one side by the common English language use of the word mind. It has a function in ordinary speech which enables one to talk about something without saying precisely what it is. And I think that's very important, because the word mind is not just a philosopher's word, it is a word of everyday English. It is used all the time, mind and mental. Okay, so this is, and I want to try and talk about the sources of this usage historically today. The question, do animals have minds, raises the whole question of the relationship between mind and subjectivity or awareness. In saying that some being has a mind, you're saying that it has some kind of subjectivity or awareness And the question is, of course, whether this can be said about animals. And if it can be said about your favourite dog, as many people think that their dogs have feelings, can it be said about your not favourite spider, or the mosquitoes that bite you? That is, once you start to ask the question about the animal mind, how far do you extend the mind downwards through the evolutionary scale? Where do you stop? If the dog has a mind, most people say, but they don't want to say that the mosquito that bites them has a mind, yet there is evolutionary continuity between different forms of animals. Okay. So, I start with the proposition that the word mind is an untranslatable word into Russian. It's a word very special to English and central both to philosophy and to common, ordinary speech. And if you go to the dictionary about the word mind, there are essentially three main meanings. The first two we can link together. Mind first refers to memory, as in the word to remind, and to remember, to remind oneself. To remind is to remember. And so people say things like, well, keep it in mind. That is, remember something. Keep this idea in mind means to remember this idea. There's an English phrase, time out of mind. Something that's always been there since very, very ancient times. You say, that's an idea, time out of mind. It's always been present. That is, it's something of which we have an ancient memory. And through Plato and the later Platonists and Augustine in the Christian tradition, it's of course the notion that the mind is a memory of an ideal form of knowledge is widespread in this Platonic way of thinking, that mind is memory, essentially. And in the Christian tradition, this memory is lost because of sin, because of the fall, because of the sinful nature of humankind. But the purpose of the use of the mind is to recover the memory, that is, the closeness to the knowledge that originally human beings had through their creation by God. And so the use of mind referred to memory also refers to thought and purpose and intention. And in ordinary English you talk about to speak your mind. To say what you really mean is to speak your mind. And you can change your mind. That is, your thoughts switch and change your mind. Change one's mind. And you can say, and you may read instructions on the paper that say, mind your step. I mean, think about how you move because there's danger. Mind your step. It's an instruction to do some thinking in order to control your life. And people say, well, do you mind? Do you mind if I have coffee, not tea? It means, if you think, do you have reasons for saying that my preference for coffee is a problem for you? That is, the word mind has entered these very ordinary forms of expression about having thoughts and purposes. Do you mind? But the third meaning of the word is the one that's philosophically most interesting. If you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, mind is defined as mental or psychical being or faculty. Mind is mental or psychical being or faculty. Well, what is mental? It's what belongs to mind. What is mind? It's what's mental. That is the goes around in a circle between mental and mind. They're words to describe a state of being. And, very broadly, the history of the philosophy of mind is the history of trying to say what one means when one refers to mind. What is the being that we call mind? What is the state, the capacity, the faculty of the mental? And the attempt to describe that is the history of the philosophy of mind. So you can't define mental because it is the subject matter of centuries of debate. What is the proper description? This is the philosophical question. And hence the editor of this book, a companion to the philosophy of mind, who teaches philosophy of mind in London, he begins his course with students by asking them to write down what is mental, what counts as mental. A thought, so they write down a thought as mental. A feeling is mental. Is a judgment mental? Yes, a purpose might be mental. But is an action mental? When somebody does something for a purpose, is that a mental event or not? And very quickly, the student answers about what is mental raise questions of philosophical character. It's common, and this goes back to ancient thought, to divide the mental very broadly into three large areas. And these words you will know in English is the cognitive dimension, the reasoning part. There's the affective dimension, the emotional part. And there is the third part, which uses a much less well-known word in English, the conative part, which is the part concerned with desire and with will, with action, with the sources of action, desire and will. And that division of the mind into three basic areas, domains, goes back to Aristotelian and medieval divisions of the soul. Now, as I've said before in relation to other words, one way in which one understands words is by understanding what they do not mean. And in English, the mind is not the soul. This is very important, that its history is bound up with it not being the same as the soul. There were uses earlier, certainly 17th, 18th centuries, in which people use soul or mind. But in modern English, it's definitely the case that people separate the soul and the mind. And the mind, if it's not the soul, it is also not matter. That is, mind is something which is neither soul nor material, the physical stuff of the world. It lies somewhere between. Now this leads me to make 4 points about trying to characterize usages of the word mind in English. 4 points I want to make. Firstly, mind requires body. There is no mind without body. It doesn't exist separately from body. Soul may exist separately from body, but mind does not. Mind is always expressed through bodily material activity. And from 1800, from about the beginning of the 19th century, there has been firm agreement that this expression of the mind through the body happens through the brain, through a specific part of the body, the brain. And so it is normal in English, it has been for 2 centuries, to say that the brain is the organ of the mind. But people do not say that the brain is the organ of the soul. That is, the expression that something non-material belongs to the body is an organ of the body, is said about the mind but not about the soul. So that the mind is in some way linked to the body. No body, no mind. But this has, of course, given rise to the problem. Well, what is the relationship of the mind to the body? And there is, and has been, no agreement. That is, the use of the word mind as a concept has been bound up with a central philosophical question. If there's a mind, which requires a body, in what sense is the mind related to the body? And there are many, you can take courses in philosophy in which people tell you different ways in which that has been discussed. And some people claim to have solved the problem of the mind and the body. Other people say it's an unsolvable problem. There are a whole range of different positions which I'm not going to talk about now. And of course, the classic source of debates, the classic discussion of the relation of mind and body is created by Descartes. That his dualism provides the terms in which many of the debates about the relationship have taken place. By clearly separating in his metaphysics, clearly separating material stuff and thinking stuff, he created a clear problem of the relationship between these 2 kinds of states of existence. Note that the linkage of the mind with the brain is rather different from the ancient Homeric, in Homer, the linkage of the soul with the body. In Homer, the soul is linked to the heart, or to the guts, or even aspects to the lungs. And this is still reflected in English language. I might say, I love her with all my heart. That is, this particular mental activity of love is not, as in this expression, is not an expression of the organ of the brain, it's an expression of the organ of the heart. Or I might say about, I react to something and I have a gut feeling that that's bad. That is, I just know in my guts, not in my brain, I know in my guts that that's bad. A gut feeling. So that even in the modern age, there are still remnants of another way of thinking in which the mental, as we would normally say, feelings are connected not with the brain, but with other parts of the body. As of course they are in many non-European cultures. So my first point is to say, well, the notion of the mental is linked in very significant ways with the body, in ways that the soul is not. Secondly, mind has consciousness. In ordinary English understanding of this concept, mind has consciousness. Or people say, well, the mind is conscious. And I'm going to talk separately about this notion of consciousness in a minute later. By consciousness, when people say, well, the mind is conscious, they mean that there's some kind of awareness or interiority or subjectivity essential to mind. The mind has a peculiar defining quality or characteristic, which is its capacity for awareness of its own activity. This awareness is called consciousness in ordinary English. I'm going to discuss this separately in a minute. By contrast, the concept of soul, particularly I take the Aristotelian usage of the word soul, it is of course not defined by consciousness. Aristotle has no notion, no word for consciousness, but the soul is the principle of life. Aristotle wrote, for example, that the soul is the cause or source of the living body. And nobody would now say that the mind is the cause or source of the living body. There's a real difference between the Aristotelian definition of the soul and the modern definition of mind. And in Christian usage of the soul, what is essential about the soul is not its consciousness again, but its immortality. That is, there is a history of the ideas of soul which is very different from the history of ideas of mind. And I'm going to say more about this in a minute. The Greeks had no word for consciousness, but they did have a word for self-awareness, which is often transliterated as synedesis. I'm no philologist, I don't wish to argue this, but I mention it for those of you who do know Greek. Now, the third point I want to make about the mind is that it is in some way, in modern usage, connected with the idea of the self. It is the mind that, in some sense, gives identity to the individual person, that characterizes the self. Now, this relationship is a very complex one, and there are many different views. But the only point I'm trying to make is that if you talk about mind, you are bringing in discussions of what it is. In modern English, you're bringing in discussions of what it is to be an individual, to have a self-identity. And of course, in English, you can have such phrases as somebody is out of her mind. And it means she's lost her sense of identity. She no longer has the capacities that she ordinarily has as a person. She's out of her mind, she's mad. Or somebody is alienated in mind. But there's no English expression for out of the soul or alienated in soul. These expressions associated with the mind, not the soul. The self can be lost. When it's lost, one has lost one's mind. And here I can also mention, I'm not going to talk about the notion of the unconscious mind. Just as the mind is associated with consciousness, it is, of course, also associated now with unconsciousness. The notion of unconscious mental events has a long history, back really to Leibniz. But there is a difference between referring to unconscious mental processes and referring to a theory of the unconscious. The notion that there is the unconscious, a structure with a definite shape and form, is of course a contribution above all of Freud, but not at all only of Freud. But people really only talk about the unconscious as a different mental structure from the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, there was reference to unconscious events, but not to the unconscious. Freud, of course, made a very large claim, many very large claims, but his largest claim was that he himself was the discoverer of a structure, a natural structure in the world which had been previously unknown, the unconscious. And knowledge of this structure shows us that human beings are not in control of their own reason. And he drew upon a famous comparison. He said, just as Copernicus has shown that the Earth is not the centre of the world, and Darwin has shown that human beings are animals, so I have shown that our central claim to status, our reason, is also not in our control. That is, he pictured himself as finally revealing the true nature of man to himself, which shows the embeddedness of the human being in the natural world, subject to natural forces, rather than being the source of reason. It's a very, very grand claim on his own behalf, and there's much more that could be said about this. Now, the fourth point that I want to make is that just as you can talk about, as people normally talk about, a person, an individual as having a mind, as the mind is defining an individual, by analogy, you can talk about a group mind or a collective mind. You can talk about a group of people sharing mental capacities or abilities or character in common. And just as Freud talked about the individual unconscious mind, Jung developed the theory of the collective unconscious mind. And this use by analogy of reference to the collective mind reflects a long historical interest in the relationship between what is universal about the human mind, its reason perhaps, and what is particular about a particular mind, its individual character. That is, the history of mind is bound up with discussion of the relation, what is universal, shared by all minds, and what is special to a particular mind. That the language of mind can refer both to universals and to particulars. And there was and is very great disagreement about what is universal and what is particular. Now, what are we to do if we look at the word mind and its possible translation into other languages? I mentioned the Russian. You have, of course, dusha. And when people translate mind, they usually use or razum. But the English word mind is not or razum. It is much wider. It includes many things other than and razum. Duch is spirit. Duch is spirit. And it's certainly spirit is not used in English as equivalent to mind. If somebody has spirit now, they have a lot of life character. He has high spirits. He's always active and doing things. And the word spirit in an earlier English is neither mental nor physical. It's somewhere in between. It's an active force in the natural world as a spirit. Like spirits. Now, alcohol is a spirit. It's an active force in the world. So alcohol is a spirit, just as much as somebody who's very active has spirit. Spirit is in the middle between mind and body, somewhere, historically. It's not just a problem translated into Russian. What is the word for mind in French? There are two words in common used in French. L'âme, the soul, and l'esprit, spirit. But there's no word for mind. In German, there is Seele, soul, and Geist, spirit. In Latin, it's perhaps closest, and the word mind has, the English word mind appears, so I'm told, has common roots with the Latin word mens, and the old German word Geminde, and these all have common roots in pre-Sanskrit. They are Indo-European. There's an Indo-European root for the word. In Sanskrit, there's the word men. Now, I'll say a bit more about the Latin usage. In Latin, there is anima, soul. There is animus, soul. There's a difference between anima and animus. And there is the word mens, which is perhaps closest in the foreign non-English language to the English word mind. So here I come to the second section of my lecture, which I call From Soul to Mind. That is, here I want to put forward some suggestions about the sources of modern usage of the word, in English, of the word mind. We can begin with the early 13th century, with the medieval synthesis of Aristotelian thought and Christianity, in which there were, particularly the thought of Thomas Aquinas, a bringing together of the notion, the Greek notion of the rational soul, with the Christian notion of the soul being an immortal principle. That these two notions of soul were brought together in the Christian Aristotelian synthesis of the 13th century. And as a result of this, by the Renaissance, by the 15th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, it was common to refer to the science of the soul. And in the science of the soul, people studied and taught Aristotle's text, known in Latin as De Anima, on the soul. And increasingly, this teaching of the text, Aristotle's text, De Anima, was treated as part of physica, that is, as treated as part of the study of the natural world. And this discussion of De Anima as part of discussion of the soul as part of the natural world brought the soul, discussions of the soul, into relationship to discussions of the body. That is, the science of the soul develops as the descriptive study of the relations between the soul and the body. And this separated off discussion of what the soul is, the metaphysics of the soul, and the theology of the soul, into a separate area. That is, already by the Renaissance, teaching of de anima is beginning to separate discussion of the soul into two domains. One in which the soul is linked to the body, is treated as part of the natural world, the cause of life. And the other in which questions are asked about what the soul is. What is its nature? What is its... in what sense is it rational? In what sense is it immortal? And they are treated as non-questions, not about the natural world, but about the spiritual world. You can see examples of the way in which the discussion of the soul becomes treated as part of the discussion of nature. For example, in Renaissance and early modern conduct books which are written to help people decide how to live well, and particularly to teach people how to control the passions, how to live with their emotions. A famous example of such a book is Descartes' book Les Passions de l'âme, The Passions of the Soul, published in 1649 in French, in which Descartes discusses the relations between the soul and the body in order to create knowledge so that people can take control over their passions. The study of the relation of the soul to the body is so to speak, a self-help book. It is to give people the knowledge of what the passions are, what the relationship between the soul and the body is, so that they are able to live better, take control of their own lives, control the passions. And in the Passions of the Soul in French, Descartes translates soul, anima, either into âme, the French âme, or into esprit. He doesn't make much difference between âme and esprit. But when Descartes writes in Latin, he sometimes does not use the word âme or esprit, but uses the Latin word mens. And when he uses the word mens, he refers not to the relationship of the soul to the body, but to the cognitive or rational principle. That is, he distinguishes mens from Aristotelian use of anima. Anima is associated by Descartes with the Aristotelian ideas, which he rejects, that the soul is a source of life. And so he drops the word anima, translates it into French as esprit or âme. But when he talks about cognition in Latin, he talks about mens. There is, I think, no point in asking what was the proper use of these words. The literature is, over the centuries, is huge. And there is great diversity of usage. You have to ask how particular people use the words, and then see whether over time there is a gradual shift of the distribution of questions asked to the different distribution of usage. And as a source of the notion of mind, I think we should observe that in Latin and in Descartes, as an example of this, the word mens comes to prominence, comes into usage, a common usage, to refer to the activity of logical mental processes, of cognition. But it does so in context in which thinking and cognition is treated as something natural to the human being. It's not treated as something spiritual, but part of the natural processes of being human. Now, in English, a text which makes a decisive contribution to the way the word mind becomes common is Locke's essay concerning human understanding of 1690. I find in these lectures, as I've said before, that it emerges in the use of modern philosophical language in English that Locke is the most influential figure. I find this rather interesting, that there is a particular text in English which seems to be the source of much of modern common English philosophical usage, and that text is Locke's. Locke, though the title of his study of how we acquire knowledge is called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, throughout his book he uses the word mind. He does not discuss the soul, he discusses the mind. What is it that acquires knowledge? What is it that reasons? It is the mind. And in his text, he discusses the mind in non-Aristotelian terms, in non-theological terms. He discusses the mind as part of nature. And this really is the classic source for modern usage. The mind is the activity of the processes which were discussed in Aristotelian terms earlier as the functions of the souls, the various levels of soul. But it is a word which is used to discuss the mind in non-Aristotelian terms. And it discusses these mental processes as part of nature, which attempts to describe what these processes are without raising metaphysical or theological questions about what is the rational essence, what is the mind, what is the soul. Those questions are separated off by Locke. He tries to describe what the mind is or does. Let me read a famous quotation about Locke and why he's so important. And this is from Voltaire. And perhaps some of you will know this quotation from Voltaire. Voltaire spent some years in exile in London to avoid arrest in Paris. And when he returned to Paris in the 1730s, he wrote a number of letters concerning the English nation, in which he contrasted the liberal, advanced, progressive, intellectual life of London with the conservative, Catholic-dominated life of Paris, as he saw it. And he wrote about Locke. And Voltaire wrote, "So many thinkers have written the novel of the soul, have written the novel, the romance of the soul. And now a wise man has appeared who has modestly written its history." That is, previous writers wrote novels about the soul. Now a wise man, Locke, has appeared who has written its history. That is, he's provided a descriptive knowledge of what it does. And he goes on. Locke has expounded. Locke has written about human understanding. He's written about human understanding for mankind. As an excellent anatomist explains the mechanism of the human body. That is, Locke is like an anatomist of the body. He's the anatomist of the mind. Instead of defining in one go what we don't know, Lovely phrase. Instead of defining what we don't know, Locke examines by degrees what we want to know. He takes a child at the moment of birth and follows step by step the progress of the child's understanding. He sees what the child has in common with the animals, and in what ways the child is superior to the animals. Locke consults especially his own experience, the consciousness of his own thought. You can see that Voltaire is polemically opposing Locke, who's like a natural historian, studies this natural object, the mind, instead of, like the metaphysicians and the theologians, claiming to tell us what the mind really is. It's a very, very important quotation, drawing a distinction between the gaining of knowledge by natural history and the gaining of knowledge by the exercise of reason. Now, Locke links his discussion of mind to, he associates it with three important things or dimensions. Firstly, in Locke, the mind is linked to the body. Now, Locke doesn't discuss the relationship of mind and body. He says we don't know about it. But he presupposes that the mind is linked to the body. And more importantly than that, when Locke thinks of ways to describe experience and to describe the mind, he draws analogies to what we know about the physical world. And just as the physical world is being described when Locke is writing by Newton, by other scientists, in terms of the behaviour of matter and motion, Locke describes the behaviour of mind, the activity of mind, in terms of the relationship of different mental particles. He treats the mind as atomistic. How do we get knowledge? We get it by bits of sensations coming in and building together to build up a building. And his whole way of thinking about how we gain knowledge is by analogy to how something complicated is formed out of something simple in the physical world. And the bits that form the mind, according to Locke, are called ideas. The bricks of the mind, so to speak, the bricks of the building of the mind are the ideas. Where do we get our ideas? We get them through experience. Further, Locke even raises the suggestion, which is then extremely polemical, that it's possible, he says, that matter might think. That is, it's possible for God to organise matter in such a way that it might produce thinking. And that is that he suggests that thought could be a product of material activity. And that was completely opposed to the orthodox position that thinking requires a non-material substance, as Descartes had said. The second, so firstly, Locke associates his discussion of what is mind with matter. Secondly, he associates his description of mind with consciousness. return to this in a minute. It is Locke who spreads the use of the word consciousness in the English language. Thirdly, Locke associates his discussion of mind with the self. That it is through description of the mind, he argues, that we will be able to say what it is to be an individual, what it is that makes human individual identity. It is the mind. Now, Locke is then a major influence in the period we know as the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Along with Newton, Locke has an overwhelming influence on the development of thought in the 18th century. And the whole notion of enlightenment, of the progress of knowledge, is associated with our mental capacity, the capacity of the mind to build up knowledge through experience. That is, we can make progress on the basis of having experience and clarifying our experience. And this form of understanding of enlightenment goes along with the problem of the knowing subject. That Locke creates the modern problem of knowledge, of epistemology, by characterizing the mind as if it were a sort of mirror of nature. That what the mind does is receive images from the external world, and this external world is in the form of ideas, that those ideas then build up together as knowledge. But it leaves and creates the modern philosophical problem, which has preoccupied English language philosophers of epistemology. Now, well, that's not my point now. My point now is that Locke's use of the word mind as an empirical object, as a subject for naturalistic study, like any other object of nature. We can study it experimentally, we can study it through experience. That usage of the word mind becomes standard in English in the 18th century. We find the same usage, for example, in Hume. In Hume's A Treatise on Human Nature, it is a study of the operations of the mind and how those operations of the mind lead us to act, behave in one way rather than another. And texts with titles like Lectures on the Philosophy of the Human Mind become commonplace by the end of the 18th century. That teachers in universities are teaching courses on the philosophy of the human mind. And what we have here is a separation in English between reference to the mind as a secular, natural subject from reference to the soul as a religious subject. That is, Locke's influence is to create a language in which English people learn to treat the mind as a natural object, not as a spiritual object. It is part of the process of what people call secularization, the creation of a culture which is independent of the demands of religious belief. And so by the 19th century, people refer commonly to things like mental science. And there's a great expansion of studies called studies of mental science in the mid-19th century, in which people study the mind increasingly in relation to the brain, particularly doctors. There's a journal of mental science from 1852. The Journal of Mental Science is now the British Journal of Psychiatry. And then in 1876, the most, perhaps the best known English language philosophical journal is founded, 1876, with the title Mind. And that, it's just called Mind, the journal. And 1876, and when it's founded, it is intended to be a journal of philosophy and psychology. And then gradually it loses the psychology and becomes a professional journal of philosophers. Note the subject matter of philosophers, it is mind. The most general term for describing the subject matter of philosophers is a term which is, by the late 19th century, quite separated from anything with religious connotations. The journal is not called soul, it's called mind. Right, let me now come to the third part of what I want to say. It's to try and say something more specifically about the word consciousness. Now, in Russian, you do have the word consciousness, сознание. And you first should be clear, I expect you are clear, that in English there is a difference between consciousness and conscience. And you have the same difference in Russian, the difference between сознание and совесть. So that, I think, is clear. But as I will explain, interestingly, French does not have this distinction. Now, it is Locke, as I've said, who uses the word consciousness. He uses the word consciousness to characterize what is mental. What is mental is what is conscious. And Locke gives a famous definition that's always quoted about what consciousness is. And typically the definition is really very unclear, but this is what is always said. Locke wrote, consciousness is the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. Consciousness is the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. That is, he's referring to the subjectivity of consciousness. It's what a person, him or herself, has when he or she perceives what is going on in the mind. It is special to the self. It's individual to the person. This is consciousness. And it is mind that has consciousness, not matter. So for Locke, it is what separates mind from matter. It's not reason, but consciousness. And hence, with Locke, and following Locke, in English language philosophical tradition, a theory of knowledge, a theory of how we are knowledgeable of what the authority for knowledge is, requires a theory of consciousness. It requires an understanding of how knowledge enters into the mind, becomes conscious to the mind, how we become aware of knowledge. And consciousness with Locke also becomes bound up with the notion of the self. What is a self? What is a person? It's a person who has self-aware. What is a person? It's something that has self-awareness. And Locke even defines human identity as the continuity of consciousness. To be a self, you have to be continuously conscious. It It's consciousness that gives you identity. And of course, there's then immediately the problem, well, of course, we go to sleep. What happens to the self when we're asleep? We lose consciousness. But Locke argued that our consciousness continues through sleep. And that if we truly lose consciousness, we lose identity. And this gives a definition of the self that's very different from the traditional Christian notion of the self as the possessor of a soul. That is, with Locke, there is a secular definition of self, a definition of the self that is separate from the notion of the self being God-given, God-created, and embedded in the soul. The word consciousness itself is not Locke's invention. It is used before Locke, but it's introduced into philosophy, not very little used before Locke, but it is introduced into philosophical discourse by a Cambridge philosopher, Ralph Cudworth. Some of you may know he was famous as a Neoplatonist, arguing for a view of the structure of the universe in Platonic terms. And in 1678, in his very large study called The True Intellectual System of the Universe, Ralph Cudworth introduced the word consciousness to describe the kind of awareness that a thinking person has that enables a person to exercise free will. That is, for Cudworth, consciousness is the quality that enables us, in thinking, to choose freely. Without this state, we would not choose, but do what we do. It's only because we are conscious, because we have this clarity of awareness in certain kinds of thinking, that we are able to exercise our will to intervene in the world. And this was his discussion of this word was part of a debate in theological circles, in Calvinism, about the relationship between God's will and human will. Before Cudworth and Locke used the word consciousness, there was, of course, the Latin word conscientia. And that Latin word conscientia gave English word conscience and the French word conscience. But conscientia and the word conscience in English and the word conscience in French didn't refer to a clarity of awareness that a person has, self-awareness, but referred to a moral judgment. That is, conscientia and conscience was a word for describing a state of right reflection, of right thinking, thinking in terms of thinking without error. Conscience is the capacity we have to distinguish between thought, which is right thinking, and thought, which is wrong thinking. When we tell a lie, when we tell an untruth, we have an awareness that we're telling an untruth. And that awareness is our conscience. Our awareness of the difference between what is true and untrue. And it's a moral awareness. And so, and that usage of conscientia continues in the English word conscience to refer to a moral capacity. Whereas the new word, consciousness, is not a moral word. It is a descriptive word for the awareness that goes with the state of having a mind. The moral usage is well illustrated by the famous declaration of Martin Luther, challenged by the Catholic Church. Luther, this is in the English translation, he spoke in German. Luther said, "I am bound by the scriptures adduced by me." That is, I am bound by the quotations I have taken from the Bible. I am bound by the scriptures. And my conscience has been taken captive by the word of God. That is, my moral awareness is the slave, the servant of God. And I am neither able nor willing to withdraw what I have said, since it is neither safe nor right to act against conscience. God help me. Amen. This is the most famous statement of early Protestant resistance to the Catholic Church. My conscience has been taken by the word of God, and I am neither able nor willing to say otherwise, since it is neither safe nor right to act against conscience. And this use of the word conscience persists in English. For example, a person who now refuses to fight on principle to be a soldier is called a conscientious objector. They're a person whose conscience is the source of the authority that they must not fight. But the word exists alongside and separate from the word consciousness. It's therefore very confusing but interesting that when John Locke, who uses the word consciousness, is translated into French, which happens in 1700, and Pierre Coste translates Locke into French. And the French version is then very widely read in France, also by Leibniz. The closest reader of Locke is Leibniz, who reads the French version in 1700. But when Coste tried to translate the word consciousness into French, he didn't know what to do with it. And he used the word conscientien in the French version, conscience. And so that French then acquired one word for two meanings. And in French, conscience means both consciousness and conscience in the English sense. And it means that in French, when French philosophers talk about the word conscience, meaning consciousness, it carries with it much more of a moral connotation. To be conscious, to have consciousness, is a normative thing, is to argue according to right reasoning in a Cartesian manner. And there are ways in which the French concern with rational right reasoning argument are bound up with the existence of this common word, conscience. It's different from English. A whole other story about these words in German, but I'm not going to talk about that. I want to stop. There are many associated problems with translation. In German, for example, just to give you one example, there's a problem of translating Hegel's famous study, Phenomenology der Geist. Sometimes it's translated as the phenomenology of mind, sometimes as the phenomenology of spirit into English. It seems to be clear it should be phenomenology of spirit. The phenomenology of mind gives a different idea of what the book might be about, and the phenomenology of spirit. Just very briefly to conclude, as a note, and I'm not going to talk about this now, in contemporary English discussions now, the problem of mind, the philosophy of mind, is becoming the problem of consciousness, the philosophy of consciousness. That is what used to be called the mind-body problem, is now increasingly discussed as the problem of consciousness. That is, the problem of mind is becoming a problem for science, as people claim. That mind has become so secularized in the English language that it is proved possible in contemporary discussions to treat the problem of mind as if it were simply the problem of consciousness. And the problem of consciousness is then understood as what is the relationship between the awareness that marks consciousness and the neuronal systems of the brain. And there are many contemporary neuroscientists who see the great human intellectual challenge, the remaining barrier, the remaining border of what has to be understood as the problem of consciousness. What neuronal states correlate with the state of consciousness? And that is a very long way from discussions of the nature of the soul. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry that I've discussed many complicated things in rather in a rather brief way, but I hope that some of the things I've said are clear. And I want to share with you my sense of puzzlement about how there can be such extensive discussion of the philosophy of mind in English when there is no word for mind in Russian. I don't know whether anybody shares my puzzlement.